We're gonna gavel in. So, my gavel. Welcome, members, to the first Finance Committee hearing, the Zoom Senate Finance Committee hearing. This is my first time doing this, and maybe some of you have this under your belt, but we will see how this goes. So we have a couple finance hearings this week. By the end of this week, we should have it down, but we have two items on the agenda today. The first off, a quick discussion with MMB on the upcoming May budget projection, and welcome to everybody here. I'm not quite sure who's all participating besides our guest, Commissioner Myron, Frans, Britta, Reitan, and then Dr. Kalombokidis are here. So welcome. Thank you very much for being here. Just a couple general guidelines for these new remote meetings. This is official recorded hearing. You're on YouTube. And please utilize the raise hand feature found by pressing the participants button at the bottom of the Zoom screen if you'd like to speak or ask a question. And then staff will maintain a list and get that to me or to Senator Ingebrigtsen, who will be chairing the bill or the committee when we take up Senate File 4486. Also, you are in charge of your mute. So please mute yourself when you're not speaking and then unmute yourself when you're ready to speak. There will be official votes taken today. So please say either aye or nay, or you can give a visual sign, thumbs up and thumbs down. So we'll start with our discussion on the May budget projection today. And this discussion will last probably about 15 minutes, not that long, because we have to get to Senate File 4486 today. We need to get a vote on that bill. And we also have the Council of Economic Advisors meeting at 10 o'clock. So many of us will be taking off at that time. And if you have any questions that don't get answered, either in the presentation or during the presentation of the bill, just email us the questions and we'll get answers to you right away. So with that, I am going to turn over to Commissioner Frans. Welcome, Commissioner.
Good morning, and thank you, Madam Chair, and welcome all the members. It's good to see you all again. I appreciate the opportunity to talk, but I thought in order to accommodate your schedule, I thought that I would let Budget Director Reitan start talking about the May budget projection, and Dr. Kalombokidis can talk a little bit about what that means as well, and get that business ready to go, and then we can be ready to talk about your bill. So Budget Director Reitan, if you could start the presentation.
Good morning, Director Reitan. How are you? Thank you for coming.
I'm well, thank you. Can you just verify that you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Yes.
I've had a couple audio issues with my computer lately, so I didn't want to be talking with no one hearing. So MMB is planning to provide an updated budget projection to the legislature the week of May 4th. This projection will provide a new baseline for fiscal years 20 and 21, which will help us understand the scope of the fiscal issues we may be facing as a result of this pandemic, and also help the governor and the legislature make more informed budgetary decisions for the remainder of this biennium. What I want to be really clear about is that this is not the same as a new forecast. The level of uncertainty with this budget projection is much higher than we typically experience with the forecast. So because of that, we are going to focus our estimates on the current biennium only, and then re-estimate the key components of our budgetary projections that are most likely to be impacted as a result of COVID-19. I'm going to let Dr. Kalombokidis talk about what that means on the revenue side, but on the expenditure side of the forecast, we will be focused on the DHS spending, updating for new economic variables and cost data. Also, the materials that we provide will be different. It will be a much shorter summary of the estimates and some of the information behind them, but we will not be producing the full 100-page forecast book that you're used to seeing when we do a full forecast. So I will pass it to Dr. Kalombokidis to talk about the revenue side of the projection.
Thank you, Director Reitan. Welcome, Dr. Kalombokidis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, everybody. So just to add on to what Budget Director Reitan said, we're going to update our projections for this budget projection. We're going to update our projections for the largest revenues, so income, sales, and corporate, and any end revenues that we think are the most sensitive to this particular downturn, and revenues for which we actually have data to make a meaningful re-estimate. So there may be some things that it would be nice to estimate that it might matter, but we don't actually have any new data on which to base that. The economic outlook that will be informing these new projections will be IHS Markit's April 2020 outlook. We gave some detailed description of that outlook in our quarterly revenue and economic update that we released on the 10th of the month. The new projections will also be informed by the current revenue situation for Minnesota, which is also described in the Friday, April 10th quarterly update. But we noted in that update a couple of important things. One, that the US economic outlook is highly volatile and highly uncertain right now. Things are still changing rapidly. I noted in the quarterly report 3 pieces of evidence of uncertainty. One, IHS themselves making a statement about how the economic outlook depends critically on the path of the pandemic, and that remains uncertain. And so all US outlook reports are going to remain uncertain as long as that's true. I noted that the range of forecasts for real GDP growth for 2020 among the blue chip 50 largest economic consulting firms is really wide. It's unusually wide. And so that also is evidence of uncertainty. And then those of you who are familiar with our forecast know that IHS produces a baseline forecast, an optimistic and a pessimistic scenario. And then they assign subjective probabilities to each of those. And they have assigned a particularly low probability to their baseline compared to what they usually do. So they have a 45% probability on their baseline. So the US outlook is uncertain. Another thing that we emphasized in the quarterly report is that the revenue data are lagging, normally lag the economic data, but also with payment delays, administrative payment delays that have been allowed to help people respond to the economic downturn. A lot of the signals that we normally get from Minnesota revenues are either delayed or unclear. And so data that we normally would have right now, we don't. And so you could think of that as resulting in our projections being more informed than usual by the US outlook and less by changes in Minnesota's outlook and changes in Minnesota's revenue system, because those signals are a little unclear. I think I can leave it there at the moment. Well, just to be clear that we will continue, once we release this, economic conditions are going to continue to change, revenue conditions are going to continue to change. We will continue to provide our regular updates on how revenues are actually coming in relative to the new forecast. So that will offer you continuing information about how things are going. So I think I'll leave it there, and we can all take questions unless, Britta, you have something else you want to add.
Okay, thank you. So far, no questions, so we'll turn to Commissioner Frans.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members.
Good morning.
Good morning. I would like to just say, I think the key for us, and we've talked about this a lot in the intervening weeks, I think the key for us is to come together in May, and what we want to do is present you the best possible evidence that we have at that time about the economic situation and the budget situation as we see it. We obviously have some federal dollars we need to understand better, and I'll talk a bit about that with respect to your legislative proposal. But I think the key is that whatever we do in May, whatever agreements we come to terms on, is a first step. And I just want to make sure that we understand that this is going to be an unfolding process. As the summer goes on, as this fall comes around, we're going to get better and better information, and we're going to know more about the length of what this economic disruption is going to be like, in addition to the depth. And those are the kind of key ingredients for us to fine tune our budget. So I'm not saying we're not going to present with the May budget projection a solution. We're going to present the problem, and we're all going to hopefully get together and admire that problem and understand it, and then figure out what's the best next step. And that's what we hope to work with the legislature on, is coming to terms with this new budget projection, which is obviously highly unusual, and work with you all with that new data and figuring out what are our priorities, at least for May, and knowing that we can't solve the whole fiscal or the biennium in May, probably we may need to fine tune it. So that's really all I wanted to say, is that our goal is to come to you all and put out the information and let's have a good discussion about what we should do about it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
No, thank you, Commissioner. So it would be fair to say the May budget projection is nailing down the problem, admiring the problem, basically. Are you expecting a full forecast in August, perhaps, once we have a little more information?
Well, we don't know when. I'll leave that to Dr. Kalombokidis to answer specifically, because the key is making sure that doing a full forecast, it takes a lot of work, and we want to make sure it's worthwhile. And so I think the key is, what do we know and when do we know it? And I'll let Dr. Kalombokidis answer the timing of that.
Thank you. Dr. Kalombokidis.
Yeah, Madam Chair, members. We will, as I said, the economic conditions are changing, the revenue conditions are changing. And so what I don't want to do is produce something that is not useful because we don't have enough data, or the data are changing too quickly. And so we will produce the best projections we can right now with the data we have. We will continually update you, at our regular schedule of how revenues are coming in relative to the forecast. And we will continually assess whether we're in a position where it will be informative and helpful to produce something more than what we have produced already. And so, yeah, it depends on how the path of the economy goes, what the revenue story looks like, what kind of information it seems will be helpful to all of you making decisions on this. So I'm afraid we'll have to just let you know as we go. We're sort of flying the plane as we're building it. And when we have enough information and enough resources to provide more for you, we will do that.
Okay, so it's fair to say that you will do a full forecast when you have information that's, as you said, informative and helpful. So nothing as an August forecast, because I've talked to Commissioner Frans about that. But a full forecast will come out before November when it's helpful and informative. Is that correct, Doctor?
If it's helpful and informative, yeah.
Okay. Senator Kiffmeyer has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Monthly basis, if I recall right, I think it was sales tax, income tax, corporate tax. I think those were the three main things. And we had how it differed from the anticipated, whether it was to the positive or to the negative. Will you continue those monthly updates? I believe they were monthly.
Dr. Kalombokidis?
Yes, Madam Chair, Senator Kiffmeyer. Yes, so per our usual schedule, we release quarterly revenue and economic updates, which provide an update on the economic outlook, the U.S. economic outlook, and revenues for the most recent quarter. And then in months where we don't produce a quarterly update, we produce a monthly revenue review, which is, as you said, a snapshot of how the previous month's revenues came in relative to our forecast. So to be clear for the rest of the members, when we produce a forecast in November or December, we produce a month. Not only do we produce the forecast for the biennium and the fiscal years, but we allocate that forecast across months. And so we have an estimate for each month what money we think is coming in. So every month we reproduce either a monthly report or a quarterly report that says, here's how revenues came in relative to what we had expected. And on the monthly memos, it's a little bit of a higher level overview where we provide income, sales, corporate, and other taxes. And then on the quarterly basis, we provide more detail for all of the taxes that make up the other category.
Good, that'll be very helpful. Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. That's going to be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. And Senator Nelson, I know you have a question, and I know Commissioner Frans needs to leave by 9:30, and I do need to get a vote on Senate File 4486. Is there any way that this question can be is easy to answer, or is it a part of the bill that's coming before us? Senator Nelson?
Thank you, Madam
There
Chair.
you go.
I understand about the timelines being uncertain, but there's a couple things I wanted to ask about what will be included or not. I'm hoping it is in that new forecast when you feel that you have the information to make one. I want to know if there will be an inclusion of a new debt. How if the state has incurred new debt, what will that look like? Or I should say our number for that we could use for debt service. And then also, how will the CARES Act funding? I think there's been, 140 million plus 1.2 billion plus it sounds like another 1.2 billion coming to the state. How is all that going to be figured into the new forecast when it comes?
Who would like to answer that?
I think I'll let Budget Director Reitan start with that. I think part of the thing that part of what we're trying to do is to get a better handle on all the federal funds, as you mentioned. I mean, the CARES Act, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, provided a number of different funding streams, as you referred to. Part of that is the Coronavirus Relief Fund, the $150 billion that was given to the states, and of that, 2.1 billion comes to Minnesota, and half that has already arrived. But we still do not have guidance on how to specifically use those funds, nor do we have guidance on how we're supposed to use that money to return some of it to local or get some of it to local units of government. Up to 45% of that 2.1 billion can be used, can be directed to local units of government. So part of our and the same is true of other funding streams. There are direct funding streams for mass transit, for childcare and education, higher education, K-12 education. All of those funding streams, most all of them, are still, we're waiting guidance on most of those. And that's part of our challenge, is putting in front of all of you sort of this panoramic view of what are all the funding sources, what are they going to be used for, and how can they be deployed. So that's part of what we have to analyze as we're going forward. And then I'll let Budget Director Reitan talk a little bit about what we are going to present in the budget projection. Director Reitan?
Director Reitan.
Sure. So most of these dollars that are coming through the CARES Act are, well, I should say all of these dollars are going into our federal fund. So in terms of how it will interact with our general fund projection, the May projection, is that unless we are using those federal dollars to repoint some general fund spending at those federal dollars, it really won't show up in the general fund analysis. We may want to take some of the COVID-related spending that we've already done from the general fund and repoint it at the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which can be used to pay for the state's efforts to respond to COVID-19. So that's where we are waiting for guidance from the federal government, because we have done quite a bit of general fund spending, if you recall, for hospitals, for our public health response, for emergency shelter, for childcare. We passed a number of provisions to respond directly to COVID. Depending on what the guidance tells us, we might be able to redirect that spending against the COVID relief fund. If that's the case, then it has an interaction with the general fund, and that it reduces the general fund expenditures if we choose to repoint them. And that's something we would do in concert with the legislature to determine what we point at that COVID or coronavirus relief fund from the federal government. But all the other funding streams go through the federal fund, and that does not get reflected in the general fund analysis of our budgetary balance.
Thank you, Director Reitan. Okay, I think for the record, I'd like to say that we do have a quorum, and I think now I'm going to turn the gavel over to Senator Ingebrigtsen while I present Senate File 4486. Senator Ingebrigtsen.
You can hear me, no? Can you all hear me?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay. Senator Rosen, to your bill 4486. Senator Rosen.
Thank you. Members and members, Senate File 4486 is the coronavirus relief account. And under current law, the federal funds from the CARES Act are deposited into the state treasury and subject to a review process by the Legislative Advisory Commission. But Senate File 4486, Mr. Chair, members, would create this coronavirus relief account in the federal fund in the state treasury, and money from the CARES Act is then accredited to this coronavirus relief account, and funds in this account cannot be spent unless made by a direct appropriation in law. And the funds must be used to pay for expenses that are incurred by the state related to COVID-19. And when the funds in the account are spent, MMB is instructed to close the account. This language was fashioned from the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. And currently, as Commissioner Frans said, there's 1.093 billion currently sitting in MMB under the LAC guidelines. And members, as a quick review of the Legislative Advisory Commission, it's a rotating membership of 6 legislators, the finance chair from the Senate, the majority leader from the Senate, and 1 rotating member. And then, of course, in the House, it's the Speaker of the House, the Ways and Means chair, and then the rotating member. A single member can force a review, but there is no language in stopping any appropriation. And at times, the LAC has been referred to as being clunky. So clearly, I think the legislature is the body that is equipped to manage and allocate money and to take the responsibility for the decisions on the appropriation. The legislature was created and elected to listen and react to the concerns of the public and to make corrections and appropriations. And the money now is with MMB, and frankly, MMB is not prepared for testimony.
Area. In other words, you cannot supplant state money in total, and or but for COVID-19, they would not need to spend it. So I'd like them to speak to those kind of situations in the CARES Act. And then in general, the Minnesota Constitution gives the legislature the responsibility for funding and authorizing. I think it's very important at this time that the legislature retain that. Even during this crisis, there should not be, except we've already passed that initial period of time. And I would like to see us revert back to normal order and the Constitution, which requires a legislature to authorize funding, to appropriate and go through all that. So if they can respond to both those things, one is the CARES Act maintenance of effort, but for or above current, and then authorizing according to the Constitution through the legislature.
Mr. Tan or Frans, who'd like to take that?
I'll let Budget Director Reitan answer the first part of that question. I'll talk about the other broader question about working with the legislature. Budget Director Reitan, thank you.
Go ahead.
Sure. I'm happy to respond. I'm getting a little scrambled audio when I'm listening to others, so I hope you all can hear me okay. But the requirement, as we understand it, and again, we are waiting for guidance from the Federal Department of Treasury, and I think the guidance will hopefully define it a little more clearly than a couple of lines that were in the federal legislation. But my understanding is that the Coronavirus Relief Fund within the CARES Act can be used for expenditures over and above what was passed as part of our most recently passed budget. The way I hope we can define it is that that budget is what we passed last May. So that as we incur expenses in response to the COVID pandemic over and above that budget that we passed last May, those expenditures can be applied against the Coronavirus Relief Fund. So that is how we are currently interpreting that language in the CARES Act. But again, guidance is anticipated to be coming from the Department of Treasury this week. Frankly, we thought we would have already had it by now, and we do not. So I think that will give us more information once we receive it.
Okay,
Mr. Chair.
Frans.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. So, yeah, I think that's really critical. Yeah, I know that the Senate fiscal staff, the House fiscal staff, we are all waiting and wanting to work together to understand the guidance. I mean, obviously, whatever we do, we want to make sure that the money is expended appropriately and pursuant to the federal guidelines, consistent with their reimbursement model, although there is discussion, frankly, that I heard as early as late as this morning, that there may be some loosening of that guideline about for reimbursement only, and there may be some more flexibility there. But anyway, your point's well taken, Senator. We want to get a better handle on that and work with the Senate and the House to better understand how do we use that money most effectively. So great point, and Budget Director Reitan explained that. So, but when talking a little bit more about sort of the fundamental role here and the way that the legislature and the administration need to work together, I couldn't agree more that I think that from our goal that normal operations are the preferred method. I mean, we believe, and the governor has fully directed all of his commissioners and all of us to work as closely as we can with the legislature to present information and make these choices as legislative whenever possible. And that's why it's been really great, though, the last 3 or 4 weeks where we've seen the legislature come forward and take action directly related to the COVID response, filling in behind sometimes some of the emergency actions so that we have the legislature taking the lead, which is clearly the preferred way. I do want to make a couple comments, though, about the difference of this situation and the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. So if you recall, during that time, when the American Recovery Act, that was when we got direct payments from during the recession. Remember, it was a housing bubble that was really led to that, and it was really almost a year before the budget in Minnesota was directly affected significantly by the Great Recession. And it really happened quickly after that year. And one of the things that happened was that the ARRA provided some flexibility, but not a lot. The nature and the timing of that was very prescriptive. The State Fiscal Stabilization Fund, which was used back in 2009 to receive the federal funds, was really directed to fund the states to address the impact of the Great Recession. So that funding was largely prescribed at the federal level, specifically for E-12 education and higher education. Then the state strategy was to reduce general fund appropriation and offset that funding from the State Fiscal Stabilization Fund. So we were responding to the direct direction of those funds to education, higher education, and K through 12 education. So therefore, we had to make some adjustments in our general fund appropriations. So that was really a much more directed response process in terms of responding to the federal money and then changing our federal general fund spending. This situation is so much different in the sense that it's really truly an emergency. I mean, I think that's number one. The legislature has acted here, and that is that they did design a process where if there's an emergency and if there's a federal funding that was not anticipated, that there's a process for that money to be used. We would prefer, and we'll work with the legislature whenever we can to come up with agreed upon appropriations that we want to use that money for. I think that is the preferred method. But the statute that is there, I agree, it's not the most artfully drafted statute ever written, but it is there, and it does provide a mechanism designed specifically for this situation. So we think that the real emphasis ought to be on coming up with items that we can agree should be appropriated. For example, one of the difficult areas is going to be the distribution of funds to local units of government. Until we get that guidance, of course, we're all just guessing, but I think that is a situation where there's a little over $900 million, depending upon what happens with Hennepin County and Ramsey County, that has to be or needs to be figured out how we direct those funds. And that is clearly an opportunity for the legislature and the administration to work together to come up with that process. So I think that we believe that the nature of this emergency and this crisis requires quick action. That's why it's been so great to work with the legislature on the Minnesota fund that we set up several weeks ago. That has worked extremely well, where we have a legislative COVID Response Commission that responds within 24 hours. I mean, the commission has been responding within hours of our request for these emergency funds for supply, mainly supplies so far, PPE, personal protection equipment, but some other emergency issues as well. So we think that a process like that is necessary during the time of emergency. And we do think that the critical thing is for us to figure out how can the legislature and administration move quickly on some of these targeted areas where we can reach an agreement on. So I think, you know, I understand the concern and desire to use Senate File 4486, but frankly, we think it's trying to solve a problem that's already been solved, and that the current statute provides a mechanism, provides for that distribution. But nonetheless, as I said, really acknowledging that we need to work together to make these appropriations. And I think that's the way to handle this. So I'll turn it back over to you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Kiffmeyer, was your questions answered? If so, I'll go to Senator Benson.
Yes, that answers my question for now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Senator Benson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Commissioner Frans. You kept talking about using these funds where we can agree. What happens if we don't agree?
Commissioner.
Gosh, has that ever happened? Well, Mr. Chair, Senators, listen, I understand that is obviously that's the nature of this problem, right? Is that in normal times, you know, we reached an agreement last May, which was really challenging and difficult, and yet we got there. I was really proud to be a part of that process and get our budget done on time and have it work out the way that it did. So I have confidence that we can do that now. You know, there are always going to be situations where we just can't agree, and I think that's why if the situation is it's an emergency and we feel the need under the governor's emergency orders to proceed, we will proceed if that's the situation. We don't think that will happen. We think there's pretty much agreement on what's happened thus far. All the spending that we've asked for authority for has all been approved. And so I'm optimistic that we will reach an agreement on virtually all these major items.
Mr. Chair and Commissioner Frans, but that was money that you needed to come to the legislature to get. Do you think you need to come to the legislature for federal funds?
Commissioner Frans.
Mr. Chair, Senator, I think as I understand the LAC agreement, that statute was set up with the idea that funds that go into that federal fund can obviously be appropriated by the legislature for uses that it sees fit and that we all agree on. It does provide a mechanism in the case that there are emergency funding requests from federal funds that were not anticipated as part of the governor's budget that provide a mechanism to use if, in fact, there's an emergency situation that arises.
Mr. Chair and Commissioner Frans, so you do think that the entire, in excess of $1 billion is available to you, whether or not the legislature agrees?
Commissioner Frans.
Mr. Chair and Senator, I mean, I think that the statute provides for some pretty broad authority. I agree, but our assumption is that that's not going to happen. Our assumption is that, excuse me, as we work through the end of session, the next 2 or 3, 4 weeks, that not only will we deal with the general fund situation based on the new budget projection, but we will also work with this array of federal funding from the CARES Act and through the Coronavirus Relief Fund. I think all of that money is going to be something that we're going to be working on collectively to get done this session.
And Mr. Chair, and this is my last point to raise, the fact of the matter is, if we disagree, if the legislative body disagrees with how that money should be spent, then it's entirely the judgment of M&B as to where that money would go. And so that's why I think Senator Rosen is being very wise to raise this now. The people of Minnesota should have a transparent, accountable, publicly vetted process for allocating that money from the federal government. Our collective wisdom, I think, serves Minnesota better than a single entity making those decisions. But in addition, and more importantly, no money should be paid out of the treasury of the state except in pursuance of an appropriation by law. And so the legislature's role is pretty clearly laid out. I would hope we would have more than respect for that. I hope that the legislation that Senator Rosen is bringing forward would in fact become the primary way we operate with the emergency COVID fund.
Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Commissioner.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair and Senator. I mean, let's not forget the process that's there. I mean, it's the governor's direction. The governor's direction about what we would spend, and it goes to the Legislative Advisory Commission. And I think the key is that there is an informed process. It was the legislature that set up this process to design a situation where there's an emergency and there's emergency funding available. And the governor directs MMB to prepare a request to the Legislative Advisory Commission. And that process is laid out by the legislature in this statute. We're simply following what the legislature directed to happen in the case of an emergency.
Mr. Chair, if I could I think the anticipation was federal money for flooding or federal money for some short-term need. I don't think they anticipated over $1 billion during a nationwide crisis while the legislature is in session. We are here, we have been responding. I think that just because our session ends on May 18th doesn't mean we should be not part of the appropriation process. And frankly, Mr. Frans, Commissioner Frans, Mr. Chair, the LAC process, the default is the money goes out, not that the legislature retains control. And so I fully support Senator Rosen making sure that there is a transparent, accountable public process for the way funds for COVID are expended.
Senator Benson, before I go to Senator Cohen, I have to agree. As the commissioner said, with all these assumptions, I think this would be a great place to park these dollars and have one of us participate in the appropriation. But Senator Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I guess my question is directed both to
Go ahead, I can hear you.
The commissioner and.
No, I can't hear you.
Okay, I'm sorry. How about that?
There you go.
Yeah.
All right. I know I'm a wizard at technology, but I've slipped a little bit. So, Mr. Chairman, my comment question is directed both to the Commissioner and Senator Benson. So I don't disagree with what Senator Rosen is attempting to do. But first of all, a comment directed towards Senator Benson. I wish I could remember the exact particulars, but having been on the LIC over the years, not presently, but having been on the LIC, I want to say in 2005, 2006, there was some significant money that came in, and I might be wrong in terms of the year. It was a little bit more than just some money for flooding or natural disaster money. Obviously, nothing at this scale, obviously, and nothing under these circumstances. But there have been occasions, I believe, when the LIC has been used for maybe more than the typical kind of LIC approval. But my question to I guess the Commissioner, maybe to Senator Rosen, is, all right, so during the rest of the session for the next 4 weeks, there's some control over what can be done or cannot be done. What happens when we're out of session? If there's more money that comes in, and again, directed towards Senator Benson's comment, that goes a little bit beyond the traditional utilization of the LIC. What happens then? We're out of session. Do we then have periodic special sessions during the course of the year, or how is that going to be handled?
Mr. Chair.
Senator Rosen.
Mr. Chair, thank you.
Senator Rosen.
I think, Senator Cohen, thank you for the question, and I'll let Commissioner Frans give his opinion too on this. But still, the premise is that the legislature is in charge of the dollars, that this is what we do. We appropriate money. and the governor would have to call us in to make sure that appropriation goes out. A very simple negotiated one-day session, perhaps, because, and I do need to commend the commissioner, because I do think we have a very good relationship, the legislature to MMB, but it still points to who's responsible for allocating the dollars, and it really does. This is our job, is to make sure that the dollars are appropriated correctly and to the best of our ability, with all the with the amount of input possible and discussion possible, and not. I can't agree with Senator Benson any better than what she said. She pointed that the federal funds that do come in are for their lower amounts, and this is a tremendous amount of money that one entity is in charge of.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just
Senator Cohen.
respond, or so Mr. Chairman, Sen Rosen, Commissioner Frans, if you want to jump in. Here's my particular concern. So I don't disagree, Sen Rosen, in terms of need for legislative oversight. You and I have discussed that on a number of occasions. Let's say hypothetically, we're out of session and money comes in where it's clear, for instance, that there's not the money available in the state for testing. And obviously that's become an issue at a federal level. And it's determined by the president, the Congress, whatever, that there's going to be money appropriated to the states for significant testing. Use that hypothetical. To have a legislative session called, a special session, it's going to take a little bit of time. We don't drop everything and come, the next hour, the next day. What happens in that kind of a hypothetical? Not if the funding is for something a little bit more traditional. Money comes in for higher education, as is the case with the CARES Act right now. But something for the immediacy of what's going on with COVID-19, where healthcare providers, whoever's responsible, need the money for testing right now. How do we handle that, where every day that goes by exacerbates that particular problem? Those are the kinds of things I'm trying to think of in terms of a hypothetical, that where there might be a real immediacy where a legislative special session doesn't quite work.
Mr. Chair and Senator Cohen, I think we've already dealt with that situation with the amount of money that we gave to the governor for an emergency account, with the oversight of the the Coronavirus Commission, which I would just like to remind everybody that was a Senate position, and it has worked very well, and it still retains the authority of and the input of the governor, and also of all the House and the Senate, which is extremely important. So in that hypothetical situation, Senator Cohen, you could do an emergency fund again for the governor to allow to appropriate money in an expedient type of manner. But when you're dealing with the local governments and you're dealing with all the other COVID-19 related issues, this needs to have a thoughtful lens on it. And the legislature is set up to have those discussions and make sure the money is spent wisely.
And Mr. Chairman, if I could just conclude, and I don't know if the commissioner wants to stay away from this or jump into it.
The commissioner does have to get going, so go ahead and have your question.
Yeah, very quickly. Again, my concern is not what we've been doing at this point, and obviously Senator Rosen supported your legislation, worked with you on the legislation. But again, when we're out of session, if there's an emergency type of thing, pulling us back into session, it's going to be difficult. That's my general concern.
Mr. Chair, if I could, to this point, these federal funds were passed now weeks ago. They were deposited to the Treasury, and we're still waiting for guidance. And so the idea that federal money would be passed, signed into law, and sent, and we have to have a 24-hour, 48-hour turnaround doesn't reflect our current understanding of any federal process. And so I guess I'm not highly concerned that we're going to have a 24-hour turnaround on federal emergency funds. And secondly, there was a process that was brought forward by Senator Rosen, and I had included it in some language as well, where we could have a fund that gave specific authority to appropriate money while the legislature was out of session. And so we have foreseen emergency provisions while the legislature was out of session. I think this is something that can be worked on, but I need to, again, Senator Cohen, you were a very effective finance chair. It is our responsibility to review funds and determine how they should be expended in conjunction with the House.
Okay, members, next we have, and been waiting a long time here, Senator Champion, and then Frans. Senator Champion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've been listening to the discussion, and it sounds to me like the commissioner has articulated with clarity the current process and the current commitment to the administration working with the legislature when it comes to oversight. And it seems as if the process has been working okay. But my question is to Senator Chair Rosen. In your presentation, you indicated that MMB is not prepared to accept these funds or to deal with these funds. I would like for you to tell me what that really means, and then if Commissioner Frans can speak to whatever response that we hear from Senator Rosen around MMB not being prepared to accept these funds.
Mr. Chair.
Senator Rosen.
Thank you. And Senator Champion, thank you for the question. What I said is MMB is not prepared for all the interest groups and the general public and their input, the testimony, the interactions that are part of what we do at the Capitol, as you fully well know. There is input that's going to be coming from the local governments about their needs and what their expenses are that need to be reviewed and have several different eyes on. I don't think MMB really wants to have that responsibility of figuring out what local governments need. They're also, they have the money right now, obviously, but it's I believe our responsibility to make sure that the money is appropriated to all corners of the state with everybody having a voice at the table. And they just are not prepared for that. Plus, as I've said before and several have said, we are elected to do this. This is our job. This is what we do. We listen to the people and we create and react to the needs of the people, not MMB. MMB is where the money sits, and we make sure that we tell MMB where the money goes.
Senator Champion, any follow-up?
Mr. Chair, I was waiting now to hear from Commissioner Frans as it pertains to what Chair Rosen has articulated.
Okay, Commissioner.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair, and Senator Rosen and Senator Champion. It's interesting. I think that I certainly agree, and I try to send everyone who has an interest in any legislation to the legislature. Let me just say that up front. No, clearly that process and the hearings and the contacts are where the more robust conversation occurs with the public at large. I think that's critical. But one of the things that happened, and I think this goes to the original foresight of the current statute, is when about a week ago, Minnesota was one of the first states, one of 20 states that received the first half of their funds. That's when we got the $1 billion from Treasury. And I want to just call out Assistant Commissioner Cindy Farrell got on that portal and signed up, and we were right there. We got the money right away, and we just did a great job of getting that ready to receive. But it was the existing statute that provided the infrastructure for us at MMB to receive that money and to have it available. So so the system worked the way it was designed to work, and now some of this is going to be quick and an emergency. Some of it's not going to be so quick, to Senator Benson's point. And those are the opportunities that we can have. I think right now, I would suggest let's work on how do we use the current federal funds to backfill the general funds that we've already spent. That's one thing where I think we can and should act pretty quickly. We still need to get guidance on the federal funds, but I think we can stand up a bill that points to the current spending that we've already done from the Minnesota fund and backfill that with federal funds, because it's our understanding that all of that will be reimbursable. And likewise, maybe we can create another emergency fund inside of the existing federal funds that has a quick turnaround process. So I think there are a couple things we can do right now structurally that will provide us that emergency operations that Senator Rosen talked about that we might need in the future, and also keep a lot of that money available for the long-term, bigger projects that we work with collectively. So I see this as a win-win situation, but that's all I have.
Mr. Chair. Yeah, just a couple follow-ups on that. I failed to mention that we have sent a letter to all the local governments asking for their feedback and for their expenses. So that's already in place. And I know that the CARES Act, there's the ability to basically reimburse what we have already spent, which would be the 298 that Commissioner Frans just mentioned, which I believe is a great idea, but that should go through the legislative process to make sure that everybody's apprised of what we're doing and not just an authoritative coming from MMB, we're taking the money and supplanting. It needs to go through the normal protocol of how we handle those kind of funds. And then there's the current spending for COVID-19, which also we can look at another emergency fund for the governor if he needs to be quick and nimble or something, but it still needs to be determined and voted on by the entire legislature. And then, as Senator Cohen is talking about, the future expenses of COVID-19. And that's something that perhaps we'll just have to, again, be nimble all of ourselves, but it still needs to have the legislature, footprint on it. It still needs to be approved by the legislature. This is very important. And I think, as you can tell, I'm pretty passionate about keeping protocol and what we are here for, and making sure it's done correctly.
Members, this has been going great here, but we've got some more members that want to speak. Senator Frans.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Senator Rosen. I apologize. I'm been in and out of the meeting. I had a eye doctor appointment that I needed to attend, and asked a lot of questions about elective procedures in my personal experience. But to this point of Senator Rosen's bill and the intent, I tend to agree and disagree. As a lawyer, I can sympathize with Senator Cohen. Of all the hypotheticals we can think about, we were trained that way, but we cannot think of every single hypothetical of situations for pandemic or natural disasters or man-made disasters. I can think of, we have nuclear plants in our state that if we have ever a negative experience, that could be a disastrous thing, that we can layer up more bureaucracy to get people help, and especially if it comes from the federal government. So I think we have to, and I know you are, Senator Rosen, I'm not implying you're not thinking through this, but we really have to be careful the precedent we would be setting with your bill and your new process. We are a part-time legislature, for good or for bad. That's what we are. When we're not in session, the administration and the commissioners have a lot of authority to implement the bills that we've passed during a legislative session. Many times I don't agree with the direction, but we have laws in place to tell them what the direction of our intent in legislation. In this case, when we are in session, I agree that we should be more involved. And I would agree with that part of your goal, that when we're in session, we should be able to help direct those funds. When we're not in session, that should be a different story, because we cannot anticipate what we're going to need in real time, and to add a layer of bureaucracy. I think we could all acknowledge that the legislative process is not the most efficient, and to have a special session requires agreement of bodies. And when we have disagreements, regardless if we're in the same party or not, they can take weeks, months, and we don't have the luxury in an emergency of weeks and months. We have days and hours, especially what we're seeing here with COVID-19. These hospitals and the first responders need things that we don't anticipate, and very, very quickly, like PPE, for example. And if we need to have a big purchase of PPE and we have to come to session to agree on that, I just don't see that being the most efficient use of our legislative process, and it would actually hinder Minnesotans' access to healthcare and to safety. So maybe we should have a set up process where during session we help with those dollars that are coming from the federal government, but moving forward in a non-session, maybe the easiest way to have is an agreement that will stay in session and special session until we are ending this pandemic. But that again, we don't know when the end will be and what the needs will be. So I have a lot of concerns, and I'm just putting them out there that we cannot legislate for the unforeseen. So when we're in session, we should have, I agree that we should have more control about how we appropriate dollars coming from the federal government. But when we're not in session, I think the current process maybe could be looked at and enhanced, but not completely dismantled. I don't know what the reactions are from Senator Rosen.
Senator Rosen, I guess that's a question. And then we're going to go to Commissioner. I think he said he had to leave at 9:30. So Senator Rosen.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and Senator Frans, and I absolutely disagree. I think this is when we're in session, that's when we need to definitely engage the legislature and make sure that the public is engaged. And I believe that that's our job. That's what we were elected to do. And I still think that anything outside of a session, when we're in session, the governor and the communication that he has with both bodies is very good, and we can be very quick and nimble. But there's and we have proven that also with the commission that we formed. So I just feel that we are usurping the legislative authority here by allowing MMB to have right now currently $1 billion to spend, and not including the legislature, as we know of including the legislature.
Yeah, I'm going to move to Commissioner. I know you had to leave. Is there any other final comments before I go to Senator Westrom?
And Senator Ingebrigtsen, just to react to that, I think I agree with Senator Rosen, to be clear. So I think we're on the same page on her first comment. So maybe I wasn't clear enough. During session, I agree that we should be more involved. Let's make that clear.
Okay.
Thank you, Senator Franson.
Thank you. Commissioner?
Thank you.
You had to leave before I go to another senator?
No, let me take a quick attempt to respond here. Then I apologize about needing to get onto this other call. But I think the key is that we do want to follow the direct appropriation line. I think that's what we should be doing now. And I've offered a couple of suggestions. I think let's start working together on what are the direct appropriations that we can and should make, knowing what we know. I mean, every day the situation changes a little bit. But I think the key is to Senator Franson's comments, the legislature did see this coming, and that's why this statute was set up. I mean, statute 3.3005 does provide the mechanism by which the legislature has foreseen an emergency situation and provides a mechanism for that to work. I agree it's not perfect, but it does take into account what happens in an emergency. But all that being said, the number one priority is to work with the legislature coming up with these direct appropriations that we can agree on. I think that is the key. And let's start, I'm available anytime to start working on those kind of direct appropriations. And if you don't mind, I will leave, but I'm always available, and I appreciate the opportunity to comment, Senator Rosen, and we will continue to have our debates, and I look forward to working with all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner, for your comments and your time today. And with that, we're going to go to Senator Westrom, and then Mr. Massman would like a few words.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Joining by phone here, but my question a little bit was for the commissioner, but also Senator Rosen, I guess, to highlight the issue. What does how is the bill restricting at law, and I guess how is the commissioner and the governor's office viewing at law, which you referenced in the introduction? Because I think it is to this discussion, the governor doesn't have the authority to change laws, i.e. Rearrange how funding goes. But we've seen this in other areas of policy and I do think it really comes down to, does the governor and the commissioners have the authority to rearrange this funding, whether we're in session or not? And they might have all the great intentions they tell us, but the actions we've seen with them trying to change laws, I think I want to make sure this is tight. And I don't get the impression from the commissioner that they see that bright line between changing rules and changing laws, i.e. statutes. And so I'd like a little more comment on that, but I realize the commissioner maybe has less left. So
Senator Rosen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Senator Westrom. Yes, as current law, there's just a review process of the federal funds that are sitting at M&B under the LAC. And as a reminder, the LAC has no authority to stop any funds going out. All they can do is have a review of those expenditures, but they can't stop the expenditure at all. And there are no minorities on that that LAC too, as a reminder. And I think that's important also. So we are asking for this large, significant, extraordinary amount of money that is sitting of 1.093 billion right now, sitting at MMB without federal guidance. Kind of asked backwards, what came first? The money came first before the guidance, and any ongoing CARES Act money to have the legislative oversight and authority by law to designate how it is to be spent. And and that's my argument. I feel that this is our job. This is what we do. We do it very well. And MMB is not prepared, set up, equipped, or should be responsible for the expenditures out of the CARES Act. That's a tremendous amount of money that we potentially will be getting above and beyond the $2 billion. And I just feel it needs to have the legislative authority on top of it. Does that answer your question, Senator Westrom?
It does, Senator Rosen, and I appreciate that answer. And I would wholeheartedly, as strong as I can say it, agree. And I think the entire legislature has a lot at stake on this type of decision, and we can be an active part of it, and we should be. That's what our constituents expect, and the benefit we as legislators bring, we bring a 201 perspectives of the state, or at least 67 plus all the House members. I mean, there is a difference in Minneapolis versus the Iron Range versus Nobles County with a pork processing plant right now, seeing some hotspot symptoms and taking cases. I mean, it just, we can bring a lot more perspective, and that's what the legislative process is set up for when we have this kind of money. So I totally agree.
Okay, we're going to go to Matt Massman, and then we're going to, after that, Senator Limmer, Benson, and Nelson. Mr. Massman. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, Mr. Chair and members. Good to see you all this morning. For the record, I am Matt Mossman, Executive Director of the Minnesota Inter-County Association, which is a volunteer organization of 14 of Minnesota's larger and faster growing counties. I appreciate the opportunity to testify on 4486. And I just really, my goal in testifying is to just offer a few comments and some perspective, and urge, as has come up in the conversation, that however the state moves forward, that there is attention given to the reality that county governments are also incurring unanticipated COVID-related costs. And to encourage that the approach be broadened, whether it's through state stabilization funds and how that's done, or potentially the approval of additional federal funding that's now being discussed in Washington, that reimbursement for those unanticipated costs be taken into account. And really, Mr. Chair and members, just to give a little bit of flavor, we are working with our member counties to pull together more specific information at this time. But I can give a little flavor as to what I've been hearing anecdotally. Certainly, as you all know, counties have been directly engaged in many aspects of the COVID response, from public health workers to first responders and correctional staff, human services staff working with vulnerable populations and congregate living facilities, but also parks and public works and licensing and administrative and financing infrastructure that supports that work and the work of frontline responders. And the types of costs that I've been hearing about are, of course, supplies and equipment, masks, gowns, gloves, the same sorts of things that you're hearing in terms of PPE from other entities, but also costs related to emergency operations center startup and operations, depending upon the extent of a local outbreak, potentially overtime, increased health staff, hazard pay is being discussed by some counties, costs to support and assist vulnerable populations and the community at large, things like leasing hotels and other facilities for shelter, emergency rental assistance, food, housing assistance, telehealth, and technology related to those functions. And then there's really a wide range of costs that have been and are being incurred by counties, and I'm sure all local governments, just to support the remote workforce and the infrastructure around essential local services. So IT equipment, software, programming, increased licensing for things like this so that we can all see each other and keep the wheels of democracy and public service functioning well. And so even as we look to reopening and bringing services back, counties are looking, as those restrictions are lifted, at planning for incurring costs such as changes to how managed counter services work, such as driver's license or other licensing that could involve construction, frankly, to establish barriers and other systems. It could involve PPE, it could involve queuing software that has not typically been in place. So a wide range of costs, and we're trying to get some more specifics on that. And of course, this is still, as has been touched on throughout your conversation this morning, an evolving situation where flexibility is important. So that really is, Madam Chair and members, I look forward, and my organization welcomes the opportunity to continue working with all of you, with the administration, just as we move forward to make sure, as we understand and eventually get guidance from the federal government on the state stabilization funds and potentially additional funding from the federal government, that those local costs be reimbursed as well.
Okay, thank you very much. And now we got a little flavor of what local government.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Chair, if I could just respond to that real quick.
Senator Rosen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Mossman, for coming. And that is thank you for your testimony. I think was wonderful testimony in the response of what the local governments are facing. And that's why I sent a letter to the local governments to make sure that we have that information on the costs. And I think that even substantiates the legislature's ability that we are better equipped to stabilize these local governments with these federal funds. And I'm anxious, and like I said, the response that we've had has been great, and they're very appreciative of somebody asking them what they're facing with these COVID-19 expenses. And I was wondering if Mr. Nauman had anything to add to the fact of guidance from the federal funds on the local government spend.
Mr. Nauman.
Mr. Chair, Senator Rosen, thank you for asking. It's good to see all of you this morning. I think you all have examined this pretty carefully. I'll only add that in some of the conversation earlier, there was question about which funds would be subjected to the constraints of the bill, or actually more put differently, would be loosened up by the bill and requiring the legislature to actively appropriate it. It would only be those funds under Title V of the CARES Act, which is specifically the coronavirus relief fund from the federal government. So only that 2.1. There's about $3.2 billion of revenue or funds that the state will be receiving in a variety of different manners from the federal government, as well as all the normal federal distributions that Senator Cohen was citing in his earlier testimony. So this specific bill would only require the legislature to directly appropriate the coronavirus relief account money. And oh, Madam Chair, I apologize. You asked specifically about the guidance from Treasury. As Director Reitan spoke to earlier, we have been waiting with bated breath every day to see what Treasury is going to tell us about how that money can be used. That will be very important guidance regardless of whether this bill is ultimately successful in the legislative process.
Mr. Chair, can I ask Mr. Norman a question on this point?
Real quickly, because we have to get moving on here. We got several that have to take off.
Thank you. Mr. Norman, it's my understanding of reading some of the language that there's, based on the formula, that Hennepin and Ramsey County are supposed to receive some money from the federal government as well. Is that money also coming under Title V, or will that money go directly to the counties from the federal government?
So, Mr. Chair, Senator Champion, that's a very good question. What I would say is that Title V covers all the distribution of the coronavirus relief money from the federal government. But the language in the bill says only references all money received under Title V. I think that would be money received by the state, but the language doesn't specify that. There's about $317 million or so that would go directly to Hennepin and Ramsey County. We talked about that in the coronavirus task force a couple of weeks back.
All right, members, we're going to have to move on here. We'd like to get a vote here within the next 10 or 11 minutes here. Senator Limmer.
Thank you. I had a question for council. Mr. Bodden, during an interim, when there's a declared emergency, when is the legislature required to be involved, and does it fit into this discussion?
Mr. Bodden, welcome.
So, Mr. Chairman and Senator Limmer, if I understand your question correctly, referring to the declaration of a peacetime emergency and whether or not the legislature will be in session, the short answer is that when the governor seeks an extension of the peacetime emergency, the governors are during a period of time when the legislature is not in session. The governor needs, the statute requires the governor to call the legislature into session. Governor Walz has provided legislative leaders, I think, with a letter to this effect that spells out his intent as far as following that statute.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Bodden, you came in a little garbled. How many days need to be expired before the governor calls the legislature back in during a peacetime emergency during an interim?
Mr. Bonner.
Mr. Chair and Senator Laverne, I apologize if the audio quality is poor here. I'll slow it down a little in hopes that what the statute requires is each time the governor extends peacetime emergency for an additional 30 days, the governor has to seek, in effect, give the legislature an opportunity to consider that extension. So the timing depends on when the original declaration was made. It's possible that, for example, the legislature might adjourn the regular session and the existing emergency would continue for a period of time before it's renewed. I think projecting from the current dates, if it were to occur again, it would be in early June. I don't have that at my fingertips.
And Mr. Chairman, one other question, Mr. Bodden, in light of federal money coming to the state during a declared peacetime emergency, does the legislature lose its inherent constitutional power of the purse?
Mr. Chairman and Senator Limmer, I don't see anything in the peacetime emergency powers granted to the governor that would in any way affect the legislature's independent authority to appropriate funds, the constitutional requirement that all appropriations be made by law. The one layer I will add to this, just for the sake of clarity with respect to existing law and federal funds, is that the statute fairly clearly appropriates federal funds pursuant to the LAC process right now. I just want to make that clear. That's, to be precise, that's the process under Minnesota statute section 4.07 sub 3 appropriates federal funds subject to the LAC process in section 3.3005.
Thank you.
Okay, let's be moving on to real quickly to Senator Nelson, and then we're going to finish up with Senator Benson. Senator Nelson, real quick.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So it clearly is the constitutional responsibility of the duly elected legislature to appropriate the public purse. And there's no question about that. But my question and this isn't the first time this has happened. And so in the Great Recession, there were those American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, that act of 2009. And I know this was alluded to briefly at the beginning of our hearing, but it occurs to me it would be helpful to know since what is the common denominator here are these federal funds coming to the state for appropriation, and whose responsibility is that to appropriate that? So what I'd like to know from either Senator Rosen or Council, how does the bill that we're examining today, Senator Rosen's bill, how is that similar or different from how the last time we were in this situation where federal funds came into the state to pay for state duties? What's the difference between what was done in 2009 with the ARA dollars and what we are proposing to do today? I don't know who wants
Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, thank you. I will defer to Mr. Nauman, please.
Mr. Nauman.
Madam Chair, Senator Nelson, the purpose of the money, well, first I should say it's federal resources designed to stabilize the state in both cases. So at the time it was a housing bubble in 2009, and the state received large amounts of resources that were then substituted for state funds in the various appropriations bills. In this particular case, the money comes to the state with three relatively broad criteria, which I think we've talked about, and I'm happy to go through if you'd like. The distinction is that there's slightly different uses and of the money from the era and versus what's happening at this point. I think to be completely responsive to your question would require a little bit more guidance from Treasury, which is what every fiscal analyst in the country is sitting around with bated breath waiting for. So we're looking for specific guidance on how the money exactly can be used in this circumstance, and there's still a fair bit of unanswered questions. What's unique, what is the same is that the legislature is debating both in 2009 and in 2020 whether or not it should establish essentially a bucket into which it places the money and has further conversation about it.
Members, to this point, Ms. Reitan would like to make a comment. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, I would agree with the way Mr. Nauman just represented that. The thing that I think is an important distinction is at the time during the ERA response, we were reducing general fund appropriations and backfilling that with the state fiscal stabilization funds that came from the federal government. And there's no doubt that to reduce appropriations in that way, we would and backfill it with the federal funds that we would need to work through the legislature in order to make that swap. So essentially, in that case, we were reducing general ed money out to school districts from the state general fund and replacing it with state fiscal stabilization funds from the feds. It was a rather unique situation.
Thank you, and we're going to finish up with Senator Benson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Senator Rosen, I want to thank you for reminding us of the legislature's preeminent role, not because the legislature matters, but because when public dollars are spent, the public voice should be heard. So whether we're in session or not, the only time money should be appropriated is if the public has a chance to weigh in. And so to the extent that the people of Minnesota should have a voice, the legislature should have a role in how this money is spent. In session or out of session, the people of Minnesota deserve that at the very least. That is our job. So I want to thank you, Senator Rosen, and my full support behind the legislation today.
Thank you.
Senator Rosen, final comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, members. I think it was a very good discussion, and I'm your best cheerleader for all the members on this committee. I think this is our role, and we will continue to work effectively with the governor and the MMB department and everybody else above. But we still have to maintain the guidance and make sure that the money that is appropriated is done correctly, and with full vetting from the public and full testimony and disclosure. So that's our job, and we do it well, and we've proven that over and over again, and we've proven we can be very quick and very nimble also. So with that, Mr. Chair, I move that Senate File 4486 be recommended to pass and placed on general orders.
Okay, members, we've had a great discussion here. For the vote, we're going to have to unmute everybody, and we're going to do a voice vote. So if everybody would unmute, as soon as I see that happening, I'll ask for a vote.
Chair.
Look like everybody's there. All in favor of the Senate File 4486 as presented, say aye.
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 Opposed, same sign.
No.
Okay, the motion, the chair, the motion carries. Senate File 4486 has been approved. Senator Rosen, what is your where does this go from here?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We are done with today. I really appreciate everybody's engagement on this bill. And members, we have a finance hearing tomorrow. We have Senator Westrom's bill, Senate File 4494.
Very good.
So, take it back to you, Mr. Chair.
Very good, members. And with that, if there's no further discussion, we stand adjourned.
Thank you.
Aye.